around the country who have helped start chapters. I'm thrilled to be asked to be here. Thank you, Chalet and Tamara and Becky and all the others. And I am wanting to welcome you also to a network that includes ACOSA as your sponsoring organization. I'm past chair of ACOSA, as is Becky, and currently our chair is Cheryl Hyde, and she's leading us in great new directions. So please join if you haven't already. From what I understand, many of you in the student network have already joined ACOSA, and for that we're very grateful. You keep us going and take us into the future, of course. I am at the University of Kansas right now. I'm directing the MSW program here and getting ready to retire at the end of June from the university. I'll be involved in our journal, which is the Journal of Community Practice, as one of the editorial team members for a while. So I'll probably see you occasionally and talk to you from that perspective. Today, I know your topic is environmental justice and social work. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to say is that I think environmental justice is a very important topic for social workers and for organizations like ACOSA to get behind. It's really one of the few things that I think can unite us in both the profession and beyond the profession. I am not a scholar in this area. And so I really appreciate just the opportunity to share my passion for learning more about environmental justice and what social workers are doing around the country to make sure that future social workers are active in environmental justice, just as we are in social, racial, economic justice. CSWE, you may know, our accrediting organization for social work educational programs, has recently included environmental justice as one of the competency areas for social workers as they go through our educational programs. And while we're behind the curve on that, I am so glad that it is one of our competencies that students are asked to demonstrate some competency around in social work practice, and that more importantly, that programs are having to include in the curriculum. You probably know some of this, but just to set the stage about why this is an important issue for social work. About 70% of all US Superfund sites are located within a mile of federally assisted housing developments. And that has a special effect on older adults and on families with young children, of course. So one of the reasons that this is important for social work is not only because our world is our world and it's our only one, and we have to take care of it, but also because it affects the people we stand with as social workers. In social work, we stand with folks who need our help and who need their voices heard. And social workers are the ones who hear the voices of folks in the community first and most. So we need to help with organizing ourselves and hearing the voices of those who can lead us. If meaningful community engagement on environmental justice doesn't happen, then environmental justice will not be realized. And that's one of the things that I wanted to say at the beginning of our discussion today. The people who are mostly impacted must be able to influence decision-making about prevention and remediation of pollution and toxins in the surrounding physical environment. There's a historical imperative for us too. There's no other category of natural disasters or natural events that take so many lives as high levels of heat and increasingly high levels of heat in our cities and communities. And there's been an interesting study on the way that those communities parallel the redlining of the past. So if you live in a community where there was redlining going on, and of course there still is today under different guises, but in the past when we had redlining in real estate agencies and lending institutions, and we couldn't find banks that would make mortgage loans in certain neighborhoods, and we couldn't find real estate agents who would show certain properties in certain neighborhoods to certain people, to certain groups of people. Those historic red lines match where we're seeing most deaths from extreme heat incidents today. So we're the people who have to, I think, take this on. Because we've always been about people in their larger environments, and that has come to involve the physical environment. So again, I'm really grateful that you're doing this work. I can't tell you how much it means to the larger social work education community and the larger profession that we have people at all levels, from students to faculties to community leaders and executive directors in agencies, who are taking this on and leading us into a better future. With that, I think that I will turn the conversation over to our panelist. And Shalay, I don't know whether we had an order that you wanted to go in. Okay, great.
Yes, so we will start with Dr. Willett. So the way this will take place, we'll have all of our presenters share a little bit about their work, entertaining any questions specifically, and then we have some questions at the end. So we'll get started with Dr. Willett.
Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer. I'm going to talk about what's going on in Nevada. I am a researcher out here, but I work with community groups and a lot of social workers. I have 2 projects. I'm going to go over them for about 7 minutes, and then I can take questions after that. And I have a lot of pictures that go along with it, so I'll share my screen in a minute. My first project is in partnership with a local nonprofit. And I just want to point out that they have positions like policy director, environmental justice manager, mining justice organizer, climate justice organizer, all of which have been held by social workers at some point. So there are a lot of macro level jobs in this area in Nevada. So on my end, I partnered with the environmental justice manager to document firsthand experiences of environmental injustice across the state. And then the nonprofits, and I supported it, we used some of the data for lobbying efforts. So we worked on things like climate issues, mining, farming and ranching, water rights, nuclear testing, and impacts from the military. But I'm going to talk about mining justice for my first issue. I'm going to show you what a mine looks like. Let me get this in presenter mode. All right, so what you see here is the Cortez Gold Mine. This is one of the most profitable mines in the world, and it is in Nevada. You can see that it carves out from the earth. It's not underground anymore, so it's very environmentally destructive. Well, what the real issue, or one of the main issues here, is that mines are constitutionally limited in the taxes that they pay at 5% of the net proceeds only. And this is one of the lowest taxation rates in the world. Now, Nevada is known for not having a lot of taxes, so we don't have a lot of services either, which makes this an environmental injustice. Also, mines are typically owned by international companies, usually in Canada. So all of this money that people are making isn't even staying in the country, let alone the local area that needs this. But this is complicated because mines tend to be in very isolated and rural areas, and this might be the only place that people can work. So the answer isn't just to shut down the mine, right? So what we were doing is trying to gather people's stories and opinions on what they thought about the mine and what could be made better. And people that worked at the mine were really concerned about the long-term impacts of the mine on their kids and their families and their health. For example, one person said, when you dig and the wind blows, mercury is there. You can't get away from it. The mining has toxified everyone. Others were often really upset that they weren't at any decision-making table about whether mines were approved, how much they were going to pay local people, and any sort of regulations. One person who, again, works at the mine, so she gets a benefit, said, "Our frustration is that there are thieves around us and we've lost our voice. Democracy is dead in America. It doesn't matter what we think or what happens to us. No one cares. It's devastating." So they're saying that when they don't have a say in these decisions, even though they work there, this is an injustice. Now, because mining is really complicated here, it's enshrined in the Constitution, people work there, really what environmental justice advocates for years have been working on is changing that taxation rate. In 2014, a social worker led the charge to change this in the Constitution, and they failed on the very last step with the public vote. They lost by only 5,000 votes, and it was really heartbreaking. Since then, mining taxes have been voted on in 2020, which lost by 1 vote in the legislature. But in 2021, they were able to close a number of loopholes, and it was considered a compromise. And again, social workers were at the forefront of all of this. The second project I want to talk about is funded by AmeriCorps to document environmental justice issues and community-based solutions that their teams could then work on. And my partners here are kids, as you see here. They go to Title I high schools. So they live in the neighborhoods most likely impacted by environmental injustice, and they document this with photography. And the other adult on this project runs Upward Bound. So you can work in a number of different fields and still work on environmental justice. So together we identified a number of issues. So in their neighborhood and only their neighborhood, we're seeing significant flooding. As you can see here, this is an elementary school, and they were very concerned that this was a justice issue because their siblings couldn't play outside during recess. And this neighborhood has successfully sued the city to have better protective flood measures. Wildfires are really common in our area, of course. But wildfires hit the outlying areas much harder because they're more vulnerable and they're closer to the public lands that also aren't entirely managed always. One of the took a picture of this from their house. So wildfires can get quite close. But the other issue here is that we're having increasing numbers of toxic air days due to the fires where we aren't supposed to go outside. Like schools are canceled, everything is shut down, except people who have to work outside in lower wage jobs. Like you see here, this is one of the youth's dads. He still had to work outside. You should be able to see a huge mountain in the background. You can kind of see it, but it is so, you can't really see it because of the smoke. So it's definitely impacting low wage workers' lives. Dumping is really common in these communities. It's the neighborhood that they live in is high, low income, and also primarily Latinx. And it's known as a neighborhood where people can dump without any repercussions. And one of the youth explained it like people feel entitled to put their trash here just because it's a low income community. And my last point is the intersection with infrastructure needs and unjust development. So in this neighborhood, it is a flood catchment area. So it really catches the water when the city floods to basically save the rest of the city. So it's a sacrificial zone. Now, as you can imagine, people that live in the sacrificial zone, nobody wants to live in the sacrificial zone. So it's very low income and primarily Latinx, like I said. Now, the other issue is, so it's a flood catchment area, but it does not have a formal drainage system. So instead of having drains under the road, probably like in your neighborhood, there are just ditches like you see here. Now, the other issue with this that you can see is that there aren't any sidewalks next to these ditches. So people have to walk in the road instead of on a sidewalk. People fall in the ditch. One of the youth's grandmothers fell in the ditch for almost 3 days. Nobody could find her. And then during the flooding season, because the ditches don't really function that well, the water goes over the road and now you can't even see where the ditch is. So people are falling in the ditch even more. And this is an area of a lot of passion for the youth because they all know one of the kids that was hit and killed because she was walking and trying to avoid the ditch. So they've really tried to work on this issue. And again, this is in this neighborhood. It is not in every neighborhood like my neighborhood. So our funder, AmeriCorps, really picked this up and wanted to work on this because the kids also wanted to work on it. And I think the thing is, this is solvable, right? Building a sidewalk or something in place of what you see here is very doable, and it saves lives and it supports environmental justice. They formed a team of AmeriCorps volunteers to come out and build sidewalks and hold a cleanup day to get rid of some of the dump material. But unfortunately, that was supposed to start in April 2020, which was during the time when we weren't even sure if we could go outside. And so it was all canceled, and we're still trying to get it back going again. But on our end, we put a lot of public pressure on people. We met with the local government up to the governor's office. We spoke at almost every event that we could speak at. We made relationships with the sheriff's department, local representatives, and the school board, and sidewalks are starting to be built in this neighborhood. So I want to finish my last 30 seconds because I work with kids, so we do fun things sometimes. And one of the kids made a song, a very quick song, about what it is like to live with climate injustice in his neighborhood. It's a little bit quiet. Let me make sure it's all the way up.
Climate is hurting, your ignorance shown, we gotta get moving, cause cities are burning, your action is needed, solution required, passion desired, so let's get inspired, the west is on fire, temperature's higher, low-income workers caught in the crossfire, let's make a change before our forests get started, 7 years and 2 months of time left on the timer. Yeah. 8 million acres were burned to ash, thousands of homes were gone in a flash, people be saying environmentalists are rash, while our very own people face the backlash, and most people treating this planet like trash, don't tell me they're doing it just for the cash, yeah, don't they know the system will crash.
All right, thank you so much. I can take questions now or later.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We did have one question in the chat, and it is, what was the name of the first nonprofit that you mentioned?
Oh, it's the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada. They go by PLAN. And I think some of those jobs are actually open if you're interested in them.
Awesome. So anyone else who would like to ask Jennifer a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Okay, so no additional questions at this time. Well, we will go ahead and we will transition to Lucretia Daniels.
All right, thank you. And so I know there weren't questions for you, Jennifer, many questions for you, but I do want to connect later about some of your youth work. And so that is so very important before I get into sort of my more canned talk, as we are trying to engage the next generation in activism, to make sure that they are getting involved as early as possible and understanding the impact that they can have. So that's wonderful, wonderful. All right, so I am Lucretia Daniels. I am the Executive Director of Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. I've been in this role for a little less than a year. DWEJ was the first environmental justice organization in the state of Michigan, and started working on these issues before folks were really even using the words environmental justice 30 years ago. Since then, there are about 60 environmental justice organizations that serve Detroit, and that can include some that are statewide, that have programs that focus on Detroit, and policy and like that, and advocacy, all the way to those that are part of like the urban farming movement. But all in all, anywhere on that continuum, there are at least 60 organizations that are focused on EJ in Detroit. So lots of opportunities for social workers to get engaged in the work right here in our city. Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice focuses on centering the voice of the community, much like what Jennifer was already talking about, making sure that those that are most impacted by injustice have a voice and have a seat at the table. And as Shirley Chisholm said, if there's not a seat at the table, then bring a folding chair. And so we very much believe in that. And so we make space, we create space for us as community members to be at the table as decisions are being made. Specifically, DWJ is focused on environmental health disparities. I am trained as a public health social worker and have worked for the last 15 to 20 years on reducing environmental health disparities in urban areas. And when I came to this role, that was not part of the conversation, oddly enough, as within the EJ space. When they talked about public health, it just sounded a little different than what I was used to. And again, being 60 organizations in this space, it was important for DWJ to figure out what unique space we occupy and whether there really was a gap and a need for DWJ. Just because you're the first doesn't mean you still need to be around, right? And so there was a vacancy for a year. There was no executive director. And so I really came in and tried to figure out through talking to the community, talking to other EJ leaders, looking at data, right? Community needs assessments, community health assessments, et cetera, to figure out where there was a gap. And where we found the gap was environmental health disparities. So there are 3 key areas that the community was interested in: lead poisoning in the city, cardiovascular disease, as well as asthma. And so all of those are related to environmental hazards, right? We know that in Detroit, 80% of the housing is built pre-1978, which increases the likelihood that there's lead paint and a risk for lead poisoning. So in particular, we are concerned about children and pregnant persons in terms of lead poisoning. And we know right now that in Detroit, the lead rates are 1.5 times higher than anywhere else in the state of Michigan. When we think about asthma, again, related to the environment in terms of poor air quality. And we know that in Detroit, 16% of adults have asthma compared to 11% in the rest of the state. And then 15% of children have asthma compared again to 11% in the rest of the state. And then you are 1.65 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease if you live in Detroit as compared to the rest of the state. And a lot of times within environmental justice, there are conversations around poor air quality or industry or access to water, et cetera. But when we were talking to community members, it was sort of this day-to-day health crisis that they were living. If you have a child that has asthma and is not able to go outside because there are bad air days, that's the piece that you care about. If you live in, if there's poor housing stock and there's not affordable, safe housing for you, and it puts your child at jeopardy to have lead poisoning, those are things that families are saying they care about. In terms of cardiovascular disease, if you don't have areas that are walkable, if you don't have areas where you can recreate, then those are the things that community was talking about that they were really concerned about, and we're looking for DWEJ to get involved with to help them figure out where do I plug in and how can I then raise my voice, make some noise, and make a difference in my community. One example of something that we did is there was the rental ordinance in the city of Detroit was to be changed to loosen the requirements for lead inspections. And so I'm sort of simplifying this a bit, but what we did is we made the community aware that this was happening and offered talking points so that they could get involved in city council meetings and make public comment. It didn't go the way we would have liked. You know, everything's not going to be a win, but we at least got enforcement to get engaged in the conversation. We had community members that felt, I don't like the word empowered, but felt empowered to then engage in policy action and advocacy. I mentioned that we provided talking points, but the other thing we did is provided training on how to use Zoom, right? Because at this point, this is after sort of during the pandemic, this was several months ago. And just before, community members were used to being able to go in person and make public comment. And this became a barrier now that, okay, I don't have stable internet. I don't know how to use Zoom properly. Right? And so we worked through all of those barriers with community members when they said, hey, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to engage in this way. Another example of engaging community members right now, there is a plan to have an asphalt mixing plant at I-96 in Southfield, which is right in folks' backyard. And we are organizing and having an education campaign around that and making sure that community members are engaged and that they are lifting their voices. My favorite meeting was, a lot of times in these meetings, there are a lot of EJ leadership, right? And we all speak EJ language. And so we're talking about, the level of pollution and what the different health impacts could be. And there was a gentleman that was a community member, and he said, bottom line, it's gonna stink, right? And so that's who, we're working for and working with, to make sure that we understand his concern is not all these other things that we were talking about. And we had university folks talking about, PM 2.5 and all of these things. And his bottom line was, when I come home, there's going to be an odor nuisance. That is my concern right now. And to make sure that we understand what those concerns are and can elevate those along with the community to help them organize behind it. There is also, and I could have shown pictures too, Jennifer, of how close industry is, right, to some homes. And if you're not in these communities, you would be surprised that really folks can throw a stone and hit industry from their backyard. And so there's also the Stellantis plant on the east side of Detroit that folks are very, very concerned about. They know there's an odor, but what is this odor doing? And so part of this is, there's an odor nuisance and it may not cause physical health problems. We're still trying to figure that out, but it's causing some anxiety, right? Regardless to whether there's a physical per se impact, then there are other impacts that we have to consider. And as a social worker, those are things that we consider beyond just, okay, physically, this may not be causing lung cancer, but what is it doing to the community in general? And then how do we better serve the community so that, again, they understand what their rights are, how they can engage with industry as well as local officials to make sure that their needs are being addressed. Jennifer mentioned this in terms of the types of jobs that are available. Clearly, I'm an executive director of an EJ organization. I am a social worker. Many of my colleagues that are in leadership roles in EJ organizations are social workers, community organizers, community health workers, just about any role within this movement, a social worker is a great match for. We have a perspective that's very different than others, really thinking about the whole person, the whole community, being able to think about how policy and politics impact communities, et cetera, is really a really great space for social workers. I have a couple of students placed with me right now who really were trained in micro social work, but are now understanding better how to apply some of what was learned in micro in a macro way, and better understanding the role of a macro social worker. And so, again, the idea behind what we do at DWEJ is to make sure that we are elevating the voice of impacted communities. We know that those that are most likely to cause the problems are those that are those that are most likely to be impacted by the problems are those that are least likely to have caused the problems, but also are the same ones that are best to identify the solutions to the problems. So I'll stop there. I see a couple of questions in the chat. So
Yeah, so one of the questions we had in the chat was, were those organizations created before or after the Flint water crisis?
So DWJ was before the Flint water crisis. So we've been in existence for 30 years. I don't know if I'm answering the question. It sounded like it was a two-part question. What was the other part, Shalay?
Yeah, I think they want to know, because you mentioned some of all of the new organizations that have been created.
Yeah, that was correct. It was in
creation.
reference to all of the new organizations that you were talking about.
Got it. So there are some, absolutely, that were after the Flint water crisis. I will say this, that within EJ in Detroit, we are unfortunately resource rich in a way and a little collaboration poor. And I think this is a nonprofit world a lot in general, that we don't find out what our neighbor is doing sometimes before we start doing something. We think, I have this great new idea, and before checking in with others, then you started creating something. And so I think that's part of the reason there are a lot of organizations. But yes, there's great need as well. And so I would say after the Flint water crisis, then absolutely there were more EJ organizations, because there was a great need. But lots of them were around before the Flint water crisis as well.
All right, and so Patricia said, can you speak to strategies on air quality?
Sure. So one strategy would be for there to actually be good enforcement of the rules that are in place. And so there are a lot of rules on the books and a lot of policies, and there's not much enforcement. Another strategy would be to have better regulation and better policies that better protect the environment as well as people. And so an example of that is, I mentioned Stellantis. And so all of the folks that are supposed to come out and check on things came out, right? EGLE came out, MDHHS came out, EPA came out, because there were enough complaints from the community that they had to respond. But what they found was that the levels of benzene and methylene, et cetera, that do cause health problems were not at a level of activation, right? So it wasn't to the point that there should be, that Stellantis should be cited, that there should be more air monitors, that there should be, right? But the community is experiencing something very different. And so having stronger policy around this, and then having enforcement of the policy would greatly improve air quality in the city of Detroit. And I will say the good thing about social workers is we know that these are systemic issues, and we don't go to some of the solutions that will come from industry, that will come from others, that say things like, we're letting you know it's a bad air day, stay in the house. Like, no, that's not the solution. Reduce the number of bad air days, right? It's not an individual problem. Similarly with, asthma, the solution a lot of times is, are you dusting enough? Do you make sure you have hardwood floors so that you're not exacerbating the asthma? Well, there are children in Southwest Detroit that are basically born with asthma, right? Because of the quality of the air there. And so that's another reason that's really great to have social workers involved in this work, because we don't let folks get away with sort of blaming the victim, right? So thank you for that question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I love that you spoke to the importance of enforcement. Anyone else have any questions? You can drop them in the chat, or as I stated earlier, feel free to just unmute and ask.
Hi, my name is Dulce, and I wanted to know if your Flint water crisis is resolved. If so, how did they do?
So I do want to be clear that I work in Detroit, and so, but I can't speak to that. So the Flint water crisis is not solved. So there are still issues with water quality in Flint. I do know that there was a lawsuit We'll see what happens with that. I mean, they won a lawsuit, but there are still challenges with water and Flint, and it's sort of absurd that we're this far away from discovering the issue, and still there are struggles within the community. But it goes back to what Jennifer said in terms of sacrifice zones. And so certain folks' lives, health, well-being is devalued, while others are valued. And so this will continue to happen unless there's a shift in thinking, and a shift in terms of action and enforcement, as Shalay said. And so no, those issues persist in Flint, and there are issues right in Highland Park right now with water quality. And so these issues do persist, and they continue to persist because of racist and classist policies.
I also want to thank Richard and Tamarie for dropping some links in the chat for individuals to review. So if we don't have any additional questions, thank you so much, Lucretia.
Sure.
Appreciate it. All right, so up next we have Shenandoah Billiot, and I will let you take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shenandoah, and I'm at Arizona State University. Thank you, Lucretia and Jennifer, for sharing your on-the-ground practical experiences. My projects are research, very much research oriented, and I'm not, while my research is community engaged, community led, I am not in the field doing the actual work. So thank you for all the work that you are doing. I actually came to social work with an environmental focus because I grew up in South Louisiana, and I graduated in 2005 from LSU, and I was working at a crisis intervention center. And I was also in the Louisiana Air National Guard, and my disaster job, which was not my normal job, was to basically be a secretary in the headquarters for disaster events. And so during both Katrina and the hurricane right before that, which I don't even remember its name, it was a man's name. I don't know. I can't even guess. But my job in those situations were to take notes, and I got to hear how social workers were responding to the crisis, with getting people evacuated, getting people to safety, and getting them food and water and shelter. On one side, these social workers were using their networks to do that. And on the other side, the people who were actually in charge of supposed to be in charge of doing that, the government officials were struggling and fighting over who was going to pay for food for the state troopers who were going to be manning the contraflow for the evacuation sites. And so for me, I just knew that I wanted to be in social work because I wanted to be those I'll just curse, badasses, social workers who were actually doing the work. And so my perspective has always been that social workers are very much involved in environmental justice, and that the environmental our physical environment impacts social work and clients and humans at all levels. I will share my screen to talk about two of my projects. 2 years in, and I still can't get Zoom to work right. Can I have host ability? Thank you. All right. So I want to start by acknowledging both the land and my grandparents. So bear with me. Eluto seyu chefa saya Santa Bilyao uma saya dulak ama e tele. Hello, my name is Shannon Dorabilia, and I am Homa citizen, and I grew up in the towns of Dulac and Montague. Our first instructions come from our family. For me, it came from my grandparents. Their knowledge came from their ancestors, and that knowledge comes from our land. So I am at Arizona State University, and the physical locations of our campuses are located on the ancestral homelands of the American Indian tribes that have sustained connections to its land and waters. These include the Acamel Ojotham, Pipash, Maricopa, Tohono O'odham peoples. So wherever you are on ancestral homelands of indigenous peoples. And these lands carry memory, and through the stories of struggle for survival and identity in the face of overwhelming colonizing power, when we become aware of the pedagogy of our land, we begin to watch and listen to the stories of that land, and we may begin to act to heal the ruptures of the past. And so I can share a link in the chat after I finish sharing screen, where you can look up who are the original inhabitants of the land that you're on. And so there's acknowledgements for many of my mentors as well. So globally, 22% of our land surface is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million indigenous peoples who live in about 70 countries and constitute about 5,000 separate groupings. This means about 6% of our world's population maintains 80% of our world's biodiversity. And although indigenous peoples around the world typically contribute the least to changes in our environment, they are disproportionately affected by these changes because of the previously discussed proximity to vulnerable ecosystems, the social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles, which are deeply reliant on natural resources for subsistence and cultural practices. For example, many indigenous peoples' creation stories are rooted in the physical environment. And finally, due to historical events, indigenous peoples as a group are disproportionately among the poorest of their societies and have the greatest health disparities. These changes are felt differently around the world, but consistently. For me, as I mentioned, I am concerned with Louisiana and tribes along the Gulf Coast. Coastal Louisiana has lost over 34 square miles of land per year for the last 70 years. And this is over 2,000 square miles, greater than the size of the state of Delaware. And we know that the little amount that's being done to try to protect the remainder of land, by 2050, we will lose an additional area the size of the Baltimore, Washington, DC area. I've overlaid on coastal Louisiana the 6 areas of our tribal community service areas, and we are a non-federally recognized but state recognized tribe with without a land base, so meaning we don't have a physical reservation. The circle there is Terrebonne Parish, Terrebonne meaning French for good earth. Has lost 61% of the total land loss in Louisiana. So it is not only one of the most socially vulnerable counties in the United States, it is also the one of the top 3 most physically vulnerable counties in the United States, in the continuous aspect of the United States. The seat of Terrebonne, the government seat of Terrebonne Parish, is named after our tribe, United Homa Nation. And these coastal communities are exposed to extreme environmental risk, which in my research and others' research has shown to greatly impact mental health, food security, water supply, and physical infrastructure. It said the host muted me. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. So 2 of my projects, there's something that's happened, but I have my screen is stopped. I don't know if you guys can see me, but I can't really see you. So I'm just going to keep talking in case in case you can see me. So perfect, thank you. So there are several types of climate change research, and some of those are things that we've heard about from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, looking at climate change models. If we don't change our laws at the government level, what will happen? What are the costs of those to humans and people in those countries? So I look at the fourth type of adaptation research, which is community-based adaptation. It's focused on the practical application of adaptation activities, and it uses participatory methods to, I don't like this word either, empower community members to develop adaptation priorities and activities. And the aim of this is to document perceptual experiences of climate change and to co-develop and implement adaptations at the local level, especially given countries like the United States don't have comprehensive environmental protections or climate change strategies or plans. So I've done this research through a couple of different phases. The first phase was looking at research and exploratory models, looking to define how people in coastal Louisiana, particularly Houma citizens, were experiencing, observing, and feeling threatened by these environmental changes. And the second part has been mostly focused on developing these local tribal-led adaptation activities. So the first was a pilot called Returning to Our Roots that was inspired by Indigenous scholars' works at Cherokee and Choctaw nations. And this was modified for Houma to identify cultural health beliefs, to inform a culturally relevant, sustainable health promotion, intervention, and land-based healing. And so we worked with Indigenous women, we worked with Houma women over a 12-week period, and we did a 7-day outdoor experiential aspect that was intended to reconnect members or citizens with the land. The route covered 126 miles over 7 days, where the age range was from 21 to 85, and participants walked over an average of 4 miles per day. And in some days we paddled canoes about an average of 3 miles. During the walk, we tested field operations and curricular implementation feasibility and the acceptability of the intervention to participants. We also conducted pre and post interventions with focus groups with the overall goal to identify, as I mentioned, this health promotion model. And so every day we asked, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And so here are some of the quotes from participants. These are from 2 of the younger participants that were in the group. I definitely want to be an accomplished tribal person. I want to do the things that generations before us have not been given the opportunity to do, and I want to be remembered for that. Not just like with the money. I'm not saying I have to make a lot of money, but I want people to be able to look at me in our generation and know that we've accomplished things that despite that we've been able to accomplish these things despite our parents being held back. We're the first generation. I am a first generation college student, and I just want to be remembered as a person who was able to turn it around, to take everything we've endured as a people and not just turn it into something good, like by whitewashing myself or anything like that, but by using the strength I feel as a homeless person. Another person said, I'd say the same for them. their future, their future generations, future ancestors. They'll only be second generations. Most importantly, though, I want them to carry on our traditions and crafts. So much of it has already been lost. We know so little, but I do want to show them beadwork. I want to show them basket weaving. I want to do different things like that and show them how to cook shrimp and gourd fish and all stuff like that, and how to utilize the environment. I want them to be more self-sustaining than I am, just like I'll be more self-sustaining than my mom was. And thinking about responsibility for future generations, one participant said, I just think it's the part of hitting the piece home of we have the responsibility. Maybe it is that a little seed planted about that I have a responsibility as an ancestor to further something along for someone, because I think I definitely walked away from the pilot feeling a lot stronger. And I wish we would have more money to be able to continue doing this. From working with the participants in the pilot, we developed a home health model for future interventions that talked about ceremony needing to heal trauma, ceremony, how it can reconnect people with the health of the environment, as well as reconnect ancestors of the past to the present and to the future. The participants talked about the land-based intervention being a space for being with mother, providing a space for bonding and a space for culture. Whenever we completed the post-intervention or post-focus groups with the participants, 6 months later, we took that information to elders of the tribe, and they said, you know, this is wonderful, but we really want this to be with youth. We want this intervention, this land-based healing to start at a younger age. And so we turned it into a age-relevant 12-week multi-level behavioral health intervention targeting individual change, behavioral change, that in hopes to utilizing the behavior change model to be able to have community influence and environmental action in the long term. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll talk about my second project, which is funded by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And our research question is, how can United Homa Nation sustainably adapt to acute and long-term stressors while maintaining the integrity of its community culture? And in this, we are using multi modes to characterize the role of movement that has played a past with citizens and that will continue to play a huge part of our community. As you may or may not know, in August, on exactly 15 years after Hurricane Katrina, we had an incredibly devastating hurricane called Ida, and our project has basically stopped. Not basically, it did stop for 6 months because our samples have been with United Homa Nation citizens who don't have homes. Many of them don't have homes because there's not been much reconstruction done, partly because of COVID, partly because of supplies not being able to get to the area. But people are living in FEMA trailers, 2 or 3 families per trailer, sleeping in shifts because there's not a physical home there, and there's not the structure to be able to provide long-term shelter. So I would love to be able to talk about the findings of this study, but we are not even close to finalizing any kind of data. We're really in survival mode at this moment. So those are my projects. Yokoke, mercy, and thank you. And I'll take questions. I know that I've gone over, so I apologize.
It is a-okay. So anyone that has any questions for Shenandoah, please feel free to unmute.
I have, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tamara.
Thank you so much. I do have a question, and I think it's probably for both Shenandoah and Lucretia, probably to explain to all of us. You guys mentioned not liking the word empowerment. Would you mind sharing why that is?
Would you like to go first, Lucretia? You want me to, since I'm off mic? Well, at its basic level, it puts the onus of any kind of intervention or action on the community, and citizens don't like it. Homeless citizens don't like it. Community members here in Arizona don't like it. So that I'll just stop it at that it takes away the onus from any kind of government or organization and puts it on individuals and communities. Lucretia, if you want to.
Sure. So mine is actually very different. That's interesting. Glad to hear that perspective. So there's this idea. So I guess the way that I hear it used, which is in the EJ space, as if an organization has empowered someone else to do something. And so they already had the power, right? And so you didn't empower me to do anything. I already had the power. And so that's why I don't like that. And there's a whole list of words that folks use. And I'm just going to bring up one because someone quoted me and I was like, I know I didn't say that. So low income has been replaced in some spaces with low wealth. And somehow that's supposed to be better. And income is something we can measure, right? If I make $25,000 and that's lower than whatever, then it maybe is low income, right? It's not enough to sustain me or whatever. But low wealth, so wealth is different, right? That is something that has value. I possess something that has value. So the idea of a low wealth community, I don't think there's an uglier thing you could say about a community besides saying low wealth, because that implies that there is nothing of value in that community. That community possesses nothing of value. And I've seen that word in EJ space, that people have replaced low income with low wealth, like it's a better way of describing something. And so I'm just really careful about my word choice, especially when talking to or on behalf of community members. And so empower is one of those that rubs me the wrong way. And then, like I said, low wealth is one that has been popping up. And I see people going low wealth. So maybe I've definitely seen it and heard it quite a bit in spaces where I am. So anyway, don't ask me one question because I answered one you didn't even ask, right? So.
All right, someone else unmuted. You can go ahead. Feel free to ask your question.
Okay, thank you both for that conceptualization. Anyways, Shenandoah, if I wanted to go into the macro field and I wanted to start a business in environmental justice, what is the first thing I need to do in terms of respecting the indigenous population? What is the first thing I must do, please?
Well, I have never worked for a for-profit organization, so I don't know anything about business, but in terms of thinking about respecting indigenous peoples, I think first just a basic understanding that there are indigenous peoples in your community, and understanding if you're maybe like renting space for your business, that there's that land, it was at one point belonging to indigenous peoples or maintained and cared for by indigenous peoples. So I think just like knowing your physical location and knowing the indigenous peoples there. I don't know what kind of business you would want to start, so I don't know. I can't speak to any of that part, but just an awareness of that of indigenous people's existence is a great start.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, any additional questions? Feel free to unmute.
I have a question. I noticed that a lot of the panelists were able to work with children or youth. How were you able to get that involvement? Was it more of like an elder thing? I know culturally, because I'm from Peru, and I know that I have a Native American origins as well, and there's this whole structure. So I was wondering if this is something like the youth wanted to be a part of this, or is it one of those like, well, your elder said you have to do this? So that's basically my question.
I think I hear your question being asked of all of us, right? So at least for my study, we were able to connect with an organization that was already in a youth focused, and these youth were already doing summer camps, and it's my impression that they've been going, since the first age available at 5, and the teens really liked being there. A lot of people were saying that the only time that they can see other HOMA members is at these summer camps, because they might live in locations that are far away. And so it was a chance to reconnect in some sense. But I kind of get the impression that they probably started because of their parents, but that, as teenagers, they like it. That's just my own experience. I'll let others take it away.
For ours, we partnered with Upward Bound. So they work with high school students that are income qualified or potentially the first person in their family to go to college. So they were also already working in the high schools that are in the communities that are impacted by environmental injustice. And we pay the youth $3,000 a year to work on the project. And they also get their own camera that they can use for whatever they want. And we have food, and we try to make it as fun as possible. And I did think that, their parents were forcing them to do this, but then we held an end of the year party, and their parents all were like, "That you did that? You talked to the governor?" So they apparently were not communicating to their parents in any way, which was funny on its own. I think because at first it was hard to get kids involved, but then as the word spread and we had to replace people over the years, we had to institute an application process because so many people wanted to do it. And the current youth really screen and orient the new youth. So it's very, very youth driven. I kind of feel like I'm the facilitator of it, and I give it guardrails, but it's very youth driven.
So I didn't mention our youth work, but we do have a protest art program. And so we engage youth, they identify environmental injustice issues in their own communities, and then they produce either visual or performance art to raise awareness, and then hopefully to advocate for change. And so we do pay a stipend to the youth, and so that's very helpful. But we do recruit, we partner with schools that do not have art programs, because a lot of that has been cut. So we partner with schools that don't have art programs and schools that have very few programs for after school. And this is something that we offer based on that. And then we have rallies and sign the youth up. So it really is they're signing up after school because we're out there with the DJ and food and showing them what this could potentially be. So it's not like the parent is saying, hey, you have to get here. They have to be supportive because they have to make sure they get there because they're not driving or some of the, right? So, but it really is, the youth are wanting to get involved, and because there's so much blight and environmental injustice that they are very much aware of, from touching it, smelling it, seeing it, tasting it, then they're really eager to get involved and do something that they feel like the generation above them may not be doing.
Wow, thank you. Any additional questions? Okay, well, unfortunately, Sarah, which was our final panelist, is unable to be with us today. So I'm going to transition over to some, closing questions. So Tamarie, the floor is yours.
Sure. And these questions are for, thanks, Shalay, sorry about that. These questions are for all the panelists. So how can we begin to collaborate with community members, government organizations, nonprofits, academic institutions, and other stakeholders to address environmental and health-related challenges?
Anne-Marie, you speak quickly. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure, I do speak. Lucretia and I were classmates, so she does know I speak incredibly fast. I'll slow down. Okay, how can we begin to collaborate with community members, government organizations, nonprofits, academic institutions, and other stakeholders to address environmental and health-related challenges?
So is the question, how can you as a student start to do that? Or is the question?
Yeah, so how can, for those of you guys who are on the panelists who perhaps have had experience doing this kind of work, how can you help students on the call begin to do that kind of work?
Got it. Okay. So one of the things that I would say is, I mentioned a couple of things. One is redundancy, right? So we want to avoid redundancy. So if you do want to get involved, there's someone, I guarantee, already working on that thing that you would like to work on. Maybe not in the exact way that you would like to work on it, but there's someone in the community that you can partner with to engage in areas of interest. But there are always ways that you can do things just on your own without being linked up with an organization. So being aware of injustice in your local community, and usually when there's a panel like this or a talk like this, I'll ask folks, like, raise your hand if you've ever made public comment, with city council, or if, right? And so those are ways that you can just be aware and get involved. But also, again, just link up with an organization that is engaged in work that you're passionate about.
Jennifer?
Sure. I think maybe probably out here, I mean, same answer, but also another answer is that I found that a lot of communities are organizing themselves and they often aren't linked up to anyone. So to value what they're doing, to go out and see what they're doing, to listen to them, to see how you can help. One of the major environmental justice victories in our state recently is that they wanted to build a water pipeline from Eastern Nevada to Las Vegas, which would have completely drained the basin of rural farmers, ranchers, and primarily indigenous groups. It would have been devastating. And they just organized themselves and they lobbied, they brought a court case, they found partners. And they had no organization, right? So to value those types of things too, to ask how you can support, like, oh, well, when you are up for your public comment, please call me. Like, I would love to also call in so I can support you all and to follow what they're doing. So I think, yes, I think people are doing this work, and to find them is sometimes the challenge, at least out here. But to know that, those groups are really, really valuable and you can support what they're doing. And some of these groups I've literally just found by Googling things on Facebook. right? So it doesn't have to be this like complicated strategy. You can find people, connect with them, just like human to human because you want to support them.
Those are great suggestions. I usually tell my students in the macro concentration class to do the same thing. Go to Facebook and let's look at, you know, who's doing what here in Arizona for us. And the public comment process in Arizona is quite easy compared to other states that I've lived in. You really just literally go online and say that you want to comment on a particular bill, and you know it's very easy to do from your home. So I think that those are very, you know, things that you can do even as a student, but I think getting involved in at least from an indigenous, you know, getting involved in indigenous issues with what's going on in those communities. A good way is to attend, you know, the public meetings, the tribal council meetings, and understand, you know, what's going, you know, just to hear what's important to them at that moment and in a given time, and ask them how can you be helpful? You know, just like whenever you have a friend who's grieving, you know, you don't just, you know, like do whatever you want to do. You're like, how can I be of help for you right now? And I think following that would be wise.
My next question is actually going to piggyback off what you just said, Sandora. Why is it important to provide accessibility and culturally appropriate opportunities for low income and minority stakeholders to meaningfully participate around issues surrounding environmental justice? I think most of you touched on, you know, certain minority groups in your areas that's really been affected by this particular topic.
Tamara, are you asking why is it important or how?
Yeah, so yeah, why is it important to kind of include these minority and low income members of the communities that are being affected in these conversations?
I don't know how to answer that. Like beyond what I've already said, so I'll let other people answer.
So sure, and it may just be kind of redundant, right? That they are the communities that are impacted, and most likely not heard, right? So, I mean, those are sort of the reasons. Beyond that, I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. I don't know. Yeah, but it's really that, right? That they are the impacted community, and usually have less access to decision makers for reasons that have to do with, you know, racism and classism and other isms. And so they're less likely to be engaged. And sometimes, depending, I'm thinking about the issue at Stellantis, Eagle went out, so they are responsible for oversight and enforcement of these types of issues. Pollution and the like from industry. And so they gave a report that said that complaints had gone down. And so that was a win for them. Well, complaints went down because residents felt like there was no point in complaining, right? It wasn't because things had gotten better. And so often that is the reason that you, you know, that's important to continue to engage folks, because it gets tiring when you're being sort of, you have a trauma response, right? Because you're being traumatized over and over. And so a lot of times the work is, just like we talk about self-care within our industry, a lot of that work is encouraging self-care for residents so that they can continue sort of to fight the fight. But it really is that they are silenced in lots of different ways. So it's important to continue to make sure their voices are elevated.
Appreciate that response, Prisha. I think a couple hands are up here. I think, is it Ashton?
Hi, yes. So just kind of a thought, it really made me think about the electoral college and how that sort of came together under this idea before, the internet and widespread information that, the general public isn't going to be able to hear from all of the candidates. And therefore, their general representatives can make a decision on who should be the president instead of going by, really allowing that popular vote. And it really just makes me think about that sort of disproportion and how maybe some of that has impacted the way that these communities are able to get into those spaces. Is this idea that, oh, well, they're not going to know, so we'll just let someone else pick for them. But at the end of the day, each of us in, all of these communities, we are the ones who put these officials where they are, and we are the people who they should answer to, the communities that are most affected. At least that's kind of the thought that comes to mind. I do have a question as well, though, so.
Yeah, ask your question, Ashton, no problem.
Yeah.
And great response. Thank you for your response.
Of course, yeah. So I actually had a question for Jennifer Willett specifically, because you had mentioned that your Research for Change team project is funded by AmeriCorps. I am a MSW student who's getting ready to graduate, and I was kind of looking into environmental justice as a potential route. Do you think AmeriCorps would be a great place to start to explore some of those opportunities, just from your experience?
Yeah, AmeriCorps, so we were funded by the Federal Office of Research and Evaluation to figure out what kind of projects they should do. And they funded us to do climate work. So they are very supportive of climate justice work. We are particularly we don't have to follow this line, but we are funded by the NCCC branch of AmeriCorps. So they send out teams of people, like 10 people for 10 weeks to work on a specific project. And then they go back home and they go all over the country and do that. And they have a new climate corps. They have a disaster corps. They're hooked up with FEMA and have a FEMA corps. So a lot of what they tell me is that people who want to work in FEMA or disaster response do go into this FEMA corps, and that leads directly into a job. Anybody that wants a FEMA job can do it from this track. And generally they're just so supportive. They call the youth all the time. They got the youth to speak to representatives from the White House. So they are just I feel like AmeriCorps is definitely a place to work on climate justice issues. I think that they have different branches, so they'll put kind of like what you're doing in your field placement, they'll have an AmeriCorps volunteer. Maybe that's more like whatever that nonprofit is doing, but AmeriCorps at a higher level, and definitely NCCC and FEMA Corps, they're very supportive of climate justice work.
Thank you so much.
And I actually have to go teach, so I'm going to sign off, but I'll put my email in the chat and feel free to contact me. And thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I think there's one last question. Is it Kiki? I think your hand's up.
Aloha, hi, my name is Kiki. I'm a social worker in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. And my question really has to do with the social worker's role when things progress. So you've already organized, you've already garnered support, you've got bills in the legislature, and you're up against, say, the U.S. Navy. What becomes the social worker's role at that time when it becomes so largely systemic that things move a lot slower, if that makes sense?
I think a strength of what social work students are trained for is utilizing networks, and this understanding that that there's not like a single cure that you alone can do, that change is over time, and it is a long-term goal that is like taken up and passed on as well. So I don't know where I'm going with this other than to say, like, having worked for the government, it is incredibly painful to watch something that's like slow moving change, and having partnerships, having networks, and utilizing your people as your resources to continue the actions that you can't do from the outside.
Great, thank you.
There's one more hand up. I know I said the last question, but this is a final question. Is it Shalimar? Am I saying that right?
Yes, I'm sorry. And if I cough, I'm like sick. I don't asthma. I don't know what's going on, but I apologize. I didn't realize that was the last question. And this also might be redundant, but as an MSW student who has a year left, and like my field placement is it's in elementary school now, and it's going to be in a credit recovery program for high school students next year. And I also work with youth on probation in my full-time job. I'm wondering how I can incorporate this like more macro level work into micro work that I'm doing, to just incorporate the two, because I think that's what works best, is being able to have these different types of work going on and allowing the community members themselves, even at a younger age who often don't get heard, to get involved. I just wouldn't even know where to begin. I got some ideas from some of the questions that were already asked today, but any other basic concepts that might not come to mind because they're so basic, or any ideas that anyone can share, I just would really appreciate it, because I want to definitely integrate all different aspects of social work into what I'm already doing.
So I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question, but what I can do is, because I don't know exactly what your role is, Shalimar, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe what your role is in those settings?
So in the school, I'm just a social work intern in the school. So I'm really just meeting with students, working on their own social emotional learning. And then at my full-time job, I'm their family advocate, and I provide one-on-one and also do their intake and assessments and discharge planning as well. But really helping them with their goals for themselves, not just in the program, but after they complete the program, and kind of keeping them decreasing risk relevant factors. But just want to like kind of incorporate their world into their community, because my full-time job, our program is called Linking Youth to Their Natural Communities, and it's the idea that if they're connected to their community, their risk relevant factors are going to go down, and they're going to have a lot more protective factors in place and feel a part of their actual community. So I'm trying to think outside the box of how to integrate some of these concepts, especially for youth who are turning into adult members of that community.
Yeah, so I would say initial thought is probably one of the things you already thought of, is getting them involved in some of the types of programs that we talked about, right? Because let's say it was the protest art program, or some citizen science type of program that's offered to youth, then that is getting them connected to the community, right? If it has an EJ focus, there are ways that I would imagine that that would help them feel more connected, more engaged in the community, and feel like they're making a difference and are adding value to their own community. So that's what comes to mind initially. I'm trained as a medical social worker, so I had some other ideas about assessing, but sort of my interpersonal practice training. But most of the work I do really is more along public health. So I don't know if I can be much help. Probably the other students that are that here could answer that question better than could I.
Although all ideas prompt other ideas, so anything is welcome, but thank you.
I was just trying to Google an environmental justice network in your area, and I didn't find one exactly in your area, but there are, it seems like every state has a some kind of coalition on environmental justice, and so that might be a place to initially start, you know.
Thank you.
All right. Just again, want to say thank you to Lucretia Daniels, Jennifer Willett, Deb Adams, and Shandora Billiot for coming on today and sharing your experiences and knowledge with us. Thank you to the MSWSN group, Becky Sanders, myself, Shirley Jackson, and Alberto. So thank you all very much for coming out. An email will be sent with a recording of this presentation, along with some attachments and some resources you can follow up on, along with the contact information of our panelists today. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we will see you next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot